Wishlists Creativity Room. Today is a cross stitch with me and a book. Today's cross stitching is from the Just Cross Stitch Halloween 2013 issue, and the designer is Ink Circles, and it's called Fire Burn and Cauldron Bubble. And this is done on a purple fabric. I will show it to you, the little tag. And today's book is Intensity by Dean Koontz. So I read this many years ago, and I wanted to share it with you because we've been reading pretty much all the same books, and I wanted to bring in a horror type thriller book for you guys. And this is my favorite book by Dean Koontz. Hold on. So before I read the book, I am going to tell you what the book is about. Past midnight, China Shepherd, 26, gazes out a moonlit window, unable to sleep on her first night in the Napa Valley home of her best friend's family. Instinct proves reliable. A murderous sociopath, Edgar Foreman Vess, has entered the house, intent on killing everyone inside. A self-proclaimed homicidal adventurer, Vess lives only to satisfy all appetites as they arise, to immerse himself in sensation, to live without fear, remorse, or limits, to live with intensity. China is trapped in his deadly orbit. China is a survivor, toughened by a lifelong struggle for safety and self-respect. Now she will be tested as never before. At first, her sole aim is to get out alive, until, by chance, she learns the identity of Vess's next intended victim, a faraway innocent only she can save. Driven by a newly discovered thirst for meaning beyond mere self-preservation, China musters every inner resource she has to save an endangered girl, as moment by moment the terrifying threat of Edgar Foreman Vess intensifies. Are you ready? Chapter 1. The red sun balances on the highest ramparts of the mountains, and in its waning light the foothills appear to be ablaze. A cool breeze blows down out of the sun and fans through the tall, dry grass, which streams like waves of golden fire along the slopes toward the rich and shadowed valley. In the knee-high grass, he stands with his hands in the pockets of his denim jacket, studying the vineyards below. The vines were pruned during the winter. The new growing season has just begun. The colorful wild mustard that flourished between the rows during the colder months has been chopped back and the stubble plowed under. The earth is dark and fertile. The vineyards encircle a barn, outbuildings, and a bungalow for the caretaker. Except for the barn, the largest structure is the owner's Victorian house with its gables, dormers, decorative millwork under the eaves, and carved pediment over the front porch steps. Paul and Sarah Templeton live in the house year-round, and their daughter, Laura, visits occasionally from San Francisco, where she attends university. She is supposed to be in residence throughout this weekend. He dreamily contemplates a mental image of Laura's face, as detailed as a photograph. Curiously, the girl's perfect features engender thoughts of succulent, sugar-laden bunches of Pinot Noir and Grenache with translucent purple skin. He can actually taste the phantom grapes as he imagines them bursting between his teeth. As it slowly sinks behind the mountains, the sun sprays light so warmly colored and so mordant that, where touched, the darkening land appears to be wet with it and dyed forever. The grass grows red as well, no longer like a fireless burning, but, instead, a red tide washing around his knees. He turns his back on the house and the vineyards, savoring the steadily intensifying taste of grapes. He walks westward into the shadows cast by the high forested ridges. He can smell the animals of the open meadows cowering in their burrows. He hears the whisper of feathers carving the wind as a hunting hawk circles hundreds of feet overhead, and he feels a cold glimmer of stars that are not yet visible. In the strange sea of shimmering red light, the black shadows of overhanging trees flickered shark swift across the windshield. On the winding two-lane blacktop, Laura Templeton handled the Mustang with an expertise that China admired, but she drove too fast. "You've got a heavy foot," China said. Laura grinned. "Better than a big butt. You'll get us killed. Mom has rules about being late for dinner." "Being late is better than being dead for dinner." "You've never met my mom. She's hell on rules." "So is the highway patrol." Laura laughed. "Sometimes you sound just like her." "Who?" "My mom." Bracing herself as Laura took a curve too fast, China said, "Well, one of us has to be a responsible adult." "Sometimes I can't believe you're only 3 years older than me," Laura said affectionately. 26, huh? You sure you're not 126? "I'm ancient," China said. They had left San Francisco under a hard blue sky, taking a 4-day break from classes at the University of California, where, in the spring, they would earn master's degrees in psychology. Laura hadn't been delayed in her education by the need to earn her tuition and living expenses, but China had spent the past 10 years attending classes part-time while working full-time as a waitress, first in a Denny's, then in a unit of the Olive Garden chain, and most recently in an upscale restaurant with white tablecloths and cloth napkins and fresh flowers on the tables, and customers, bless them, who routinely tipped 15 or 20%. This visit to the Templetons' house in the Napa Valley would be the closest thing to a vacation that she'd had in a decade. From San Francisco, Laura had followed Interstate 80 through Berkeley and across the eastern end of San Pablo Bay. Blue Heron had stalked the shallows and leaped gracefully into flight, enormous, eerily prehistoric, beautiful against the cloudless heavens. Now, in the gold and crimson sunset, scattered clouds burned in the sky, and the Napa Valley unrolled like a radiant tapestry. Laura had departed the main road in favor of a scenic route. However, she drove so fast that China was seldom able to take her eyes off the highway to enjoy the scenery. "Man, I love speed," Laura said. "I hate it. I like to move, streak, fly. Hey, maybe I was a gazelle in a previous life. You think?" China looked at the speedometer and grimaced. "Yeah, maybe a gazelle, or a mad woman locked away in Bedlam. Or a cheetah. Cheetahs are really fast." "Yeah, a cheetah, and one day you were chasing your prey and ran straight off the edge of a cliff at full tilt. You were the wily coyote of cheetahs." "I'm a good driver, China." "I know." "Then relax." "I can't." Laura sighed with fake expiration. "Ever?" "When I sleep," China said, and she nearly jammed her feet through the floorboards as the Mustang took a wide curve at high speed. Beyond the narrow graveled shoulder of the two-lane, The land sloped down through wild mustard and looping brambles to a row of tall black alders fringed with early spring buds. Beyond the alders lay vineyards drenched with fierce red light, and China was convinced that the car would slide off the blacktop, roll down the embankment, and crash into the trees, and that her blood would fertilize the nearest of the vines. Instead, Laura effortlessly held the Mustang to the pavement. The car swept out of the curve and up a long incline. Laura said, "I bet you even worry in your sleep." Well, sooner or later in every dream there's a boogeyman. We've got to be on the lookout for him. "I have lots of dreams without boogeymen," Laura said. "I have wonderful dreams. Getting shot out of a cannon? That would be fun. No, but sometimes I dream that I can fly. I'm always naked and just floating or swooping along 50 feet above the ground, over telephone lines, across fields of bright flowers, over treetops, so free. People look up and smile and wave. They're so delighted to see that I can fly, so happy for me. And sometimes I'm with this beautiful guy, lean and muscular, with a mane of golden hair and lovely green eyes that look all the way through me to my soul. And we're making love in midair, drifting up there, and I'm having spectacular orgasms, one after another, floating through sunshine with flowers below, and birds swooping overhead, birds with these gorgeous iridescent blue wings, and singing the most fantastic bird songs you ever heard. And I feel as if I'm full of dazzling light, just a creature of light, and like I'm going to explode, such an energy, explode and form a whole new universe, and be the universe, and live forever. You ever have a dream like that?" China had finally taken her eyes off the unrushing blacktop. She stared in blank-faced astonishment at Laura. Finally she said, "No." Glancing away from the two-lane, Laura said, "Really? You never had a dream like that?" "Never. I have lots of dreams like that. Could you keep your eyes on the road, kiddo?" Laura looked at the highway and said, "Don't you ever dream about sex?" "Sometimes." "And?" "What?" "And?" China shrugged. "It's bad." Frowning, Laura said, "You dream about having bad sex?" "Listen, China, you don't have to dream about that. There are lots of guys who can provide all the bad sex you want." "Ho, ho, I mean, these are nightmares, very threatening." "Sex is threatening?" "Because I'm always a little girl in the dream, 6 or 7 or 8, and I'm always hiding from this man. Not quite sure what he wants, why he's looking for me, but I know he wants something from me that he shouldn't have, something terrible, and it's going to be like dying." "Who's the man?" "Different men. Some of the creeps your mother used to hang out with." China had told Laura a great deal about her mother. She had never told anyone else. "Yeah, them. I always got away from them in real life. They never touched me. And they never touch me in the dreams. But there's always a threat, always a possibility." "So these aren't just dreams? They're memories too?" "I wish they were just dreams." "What about when you're awake?" Laura asked. "What do you mean? Do you just turn all warm and fuzzy and let yourself go when a man makes love to you, or is the past always there?" "What is this? Analysis at 80 miles an hour?" Dodging the question. "You're a snoop. It's called friendship. It's called snoopery." Dodging the question. China sighed. "All right. I like being with a man. I'm not inhibited. I'll admit that I've never felt as though I'm a creature of light going to explode into a new universe. But I've been fully satisfied, always had fun." "Fully?" "Fully." China had never actually been with a man until she was 21, and her intimate relationships now totaled exactly 2. Both had been gentle, kind, and decent men, and in each case China had greatly enjoyed the lovemaking. One affair had lasted 11 months, the other 13, and neither lover had left her a single troubling memory. Nevertheless, neither man had helped her banish the vicious dreams, which continued to plague her periodically, and she'd been unable to achieve an emotional bond equal to the physical intimacy. To a man whom she loved, China could give her body, but even for love, she could not entirely give her mind and heart. She was afraid to commit herself to trust without reservation. No one in her life, with the possible exception of Laura Templeton, stunt driver and dream flyer, had ever earned total trust. Wind shrieked along the sides of the car. In the flickering shadows and fiery light, the lawn incline ahead of them seemed to be a ramp, as if they were going to be launched into space when they reached the top, vaulting across a dozen burning buses while a stadium full of thrill-seekers cheered. "What if a tire blows?" China asked. "The tires won't blow," Laura said confidently. "What if one does?" Wrenching her face into an exaggerated demonic grin, Laura said, "Then we're just grilled jelly in a can. They won't even be able to separate the remains into two distinct bodies, a total amorphous mess. They won't even need coffins for us. They'll just pour our remains in a jug and put us in one grave, and the headstone will read, Laura China Templeton Shepherd. Only a Cuisinart would have been more thorough." China had hair so dark that it was virtually black, and Laura was a blue-eyed blonde, yet they were enough alike to be sisters. Both were 5'4" and slender. They wore the same dress size. Each had high cheekbones and delicate features. China had always felt that her mouth was too wide, but Laura, whose mouth was as wide as China's, said it wasn't wide at all, but merely generous enough to ensure an especially winning smile. As Laura's love of speed proved, however, they were in some ways profoundly different people. The difference, perhaps more than the similarities, were what drew them to each other. "You think your mom and dad will like me?" China asked. "I thought you were worried about a blown tire." "I'm a multi-channel warrior. Will they like me?" "Of course they'll like you. You know what I worry about?" Laura asked as they raced toward the top of the incline. Apparently not death. "You. I worry about you," Laura said. She glanced at China, and her expression was uncharacteristically serious. "I can take care of myself," China assured her. "I don't doubt that. I know you too well to doubt that. But life isn't just about taking care of yourself, keeping your head down, getting through." Laura Templeton, girl philosopher. "Life is about living." "Deep," China said sarcastically. "Deeper than you think." The Mustang crested the lawn hill, and there were no burning buses or cheering multitudes, but ahead of them was an older metal Buick cruising well below the posted limit. Laura cut their speed by more than half, and they pulled behind the other car. Even in the fading light, China could see that the round-shouldered driver was a white-haired elderly man. They were in a no-passing zone. The road rose and fell, turned left and right, rose again, and they could not see far ahead. Laura switched on the Mustang headlights, hoping to encourage the driver of the Buick either to increase his speed or to ease over where the shoulder widened to let them pass. "Take your own advice. Relax, kiddo," China said. "Hate to be late for dinner." "From everything you've said about her, I don't think your mom's the type to beat us with wire coat hangers. Mom's the best." "So relax," China said. "But she has this disappointed look she gives you that's worse than wire coat hangers. Most people don't know this, but Mom is the reason the Cold War ended. Several years ago, the Pentagon sent her off to Moscow so she could give the whole damn Politburo the look. and all those Soviet thugs just collapsed with remorse. Ahead of them, the old man in the Buick checked his rear-view mirror. The white hair in the headlight beams, the angle of the man's head, and the mere suggestion of his eyes reflected in the mirror suddenly engendered in China a powerful sense of déjà vu. For a moment, she didn't understand why a chill came over her, but then she was cast back in memory to an incident that she had long tried unsuccessfully to forget. Another twilight, 19 years ago, a lonely Florida highway. "Oh, Jesus," she said. Laura glanced at her. "What's wrong?" China closed her eyes. "China, you're as white as a ghost. What is it?" "A long time ago, when I was just a little girl, 7 years old. Maybe we were in the Everglades, maybe not, but the land was swampy like the glades. There weren't many trees, and the few you could see were hung with Spanish moss. Everything was flat as far as you could see, lots of sky and flatness. The sunlight red and fading like now, a back road somewhere, far away from anything. Very rural, 2 narrow lanes, so damn empty and lonely." China had been with her mother and Jim Woltz, a Key West drug dealer and gun runner with whom they had lived now and then for a month or two at a time during her childhood. They had been on a business trip and had been returning to the Keys in Woltz's vintage red Cadillac, one of those models with massive tail fins and with what seemed to be 5 tons of chrome grille work. Woltz was driving fast on that straight highway, exceeding 100 miles an hour at times. They hadn't encountered another car for almost 15 minutes before they roared up behind the elderly couple in the tan Mercedes. The woman was driving, bird-like, close-cropped silver hair. 75 if she was a day. She was doing 40 miles an hour. Woltz could have pulled around the Mercedes. They were in a passing zone, and no traffic was in sight for miles on that dead, flat highway. But he was high on something, China told Laura, eyes still closed, watching the memory with a growing dread as it played like a movie on the screen behind her eyes. He was most of the time high on something. Maybe it was cocaine that day. I don't know. Don't remember. He was drinking, too. They were both drinking, him and my mother. They had a cooler full of ice, bottles of grapefruit juice and vodka. The old lady in the Mercedes was driving really slow, and that incensed Woltz. He wasn't rational. What did it matter to him? He could have pulled around her, but the sight of her driving so slow on the wide open highway infuriated him. Drugs and booze, that's all. So irrational. When he was angry, red-faced, arteries throbbing in his neck, jaw muscles bulging. No one could get angry quite as totally as Jim Woltz. His rage excited my mother, always excited her, so she teased him, encouraged him. I was in the back seat, hanging on tight, pleading with her to stop, but she kept at him. For a while, Woltz had hung close behind the other car, blowing his horn at the elderly couple, trying to force them to go faster. A few times he had nudged the rear bumper of the Mercedes with the front bumper of the Cadillac, metal kissing metal with a squeal. Eventually, the old woman got rattled and began to swerve erratically, afraid to go faster with Woltz so close behind her, but too frightened of him to pull off the road and let him pass by. Of course, China said, he wouldn't have gone past and left her alone. By then, he was too psychotic. He would have stopped when she stopped. It still would have ended badly. Woltz had pulled alongside the Mercedes a few times, driving in the wrong lane, shouting and shaking his fist at the white-haired couple, who first tried to ignore him and then stared back wide-eyed and fearful. Each time, rather than drive by and leave them in his dust, he had dropped behind again to play tag with their rear bumper. To Waltz, in his drug fever and alcoholic haze, this harassment was deadly serious business, with an importance and a meaning that could never be understood by anyone who was clean and sober. To China's mother, Anne, it was all a game, an adventure, and it was she, in her ceaseless search for excitement, who said, "Why don't we give her a driving tester?" Excuse me. I will reread that. Who said, "Why don't we give her a driving test?" Waltz said, "Test? I don't need to give the old bitch a test to see she can't drive for shit." This time, as Waltz pulled beside the Mercedes, matching speeds with it, Anne said, see if she can keep it on the road. Make it a challenge for her." To Laura, China recalled, there was a canal parallel to the road, one of those drainage channels you see along some Florida highways. Not deep, but deep enough. Waltz used the Cadillac to crowd the Mercedes onto the shoulder of the road. The woman should have crowded him back, forced him the other way. She should have tramped the pedal to the floor and pegged the speedometer and gotten the hell out of there. The Mercedes would have outrun the Cadillac, no problem, but she was old and scared, and she'd never encountered anyone like this. I think she was just believing, so unable to understand the kind of people she was up against, unable to grasp how far they'd go, even though she and her husband had done nothing to them. Waltz forced her off the road. The Mercedes rolled into the canal. Waltz had stopped, shifted the Cadillac into reverse, and backed up to where the Mercedes was swiftly sinking. He and Anne had gotten out of the car to watch. China's mother had insisted that she watch too. "Come on, you little chicken. You don't want to miss this, baby. This is one to remember." The passenger side of the Mercedes was flat against the muddy bottom of the canal, and the driver's side was revealed to them as they stood on the embankment in the humid evening air. They were being bitten by hordes of mosquitoes that were hardly aware of them, mesmerized by the sight below them, gazing through the driver's side windows of the submerged vehicle. It was twilight, China told Laura, putting into words the images behind her closed eyes, so the headlights were on, still on even after the Mercedes sank, and there were lights inside the car. They had air conditioning, so all the windows were closed, and neither the windshield nor the driver's side window had shattered when the car rolled. We could see inside, because the windows were only a few inches underwater. There was no sign of the husband. Maybe he was knocked unconscious when they rolled. But the old woman, her face was at the window. The car was flooded, but there was a big bubble of air against the inside of the glass, and she pressed her face into it so she could breathe. We stood there, looking down at her. Waltz could have helped. My mother could have helped, but they just watched. The old woman couldn't seem to get the window open, and the door must have been jammed, or maybe she was just too scared and too weak. China had tried to pull away, but her mother had held her, speaking urgently to her, the whispered words born on a tide of breath, sour with vodka and grapefruit juice. "We are different than other people, baby. No rules apply to us. You'll never understand what freedom really means if you don't watch this." China had closed her eyes, but she had still been able to hear the old woman screaming into the big air bubble inside the submerged car. Muffled screaming. Then gradually the screaming faded. "Finally stopped," China told Laura. "When I opened my eyes, twilight had gone and night had come. There was still light in the Mercedes, and the woman's face was still pressed to the glass, but a breeze had risen, rippling the water in the canal, and her features were a blur. I knew she was dead, she and her husband. I started to cry. Waltz didn't like that. He threatened to drag me into the canal, open the door in the Mercedes, and shove me inside with the dead people. My mother made me drink some grapefruit juice with vodka. I was only 7. The rest of the way back to Key West, I lay on the back seat, dizzy from the vodka, half drunk and a little sick, still crying, but quietly, so I wouldn't make Woltz angry, crying quietly until I fell asleep. In Laura's Mustang, the only sounds were the soft rumble of the engine and the singing of the tires on the blacktop. China finally opened her eyes and came back from the memory of Florida, from the long-ago humid twilight to the Napa Valley, where most of the red light had gone out of the sky and darkness encroached on all sides. The old man in the Buick was no longer in front of them. They were not driving as fast as before, and evidently he had gotten far ahead of them. Laura said softly, "Dear God." China was shaking uncontrollably. She plucked a few Kleenex from the console box between the seats, blew her nose, and blotted her eyes. Over the past 2 years, she had shared part of her childhood with Laura, but every new revelation, and there was much still to reveal, was as difficult as the one before it. When she spoke of the past, she always burned with shame, as though she had been as guilty as her mother, as if every criminal act and spell of madness could be blamed on her, though she had been only a helpless child trapped in the insanity of others. "Will you ever see her again?" Laura asked. Recollection had left China half numb with horror. "I don't know." "Would you want to?" China hesitated. Her hands were curled into fists, the damp Kleenex wadded in the right one. "Maybe." "For God's sake, why?" To ask her why? To try to understand, to settle some things, but maybe not. "Do you even know where she is?" "No, but it wouldn't surprise me if she was in jail or dead. You can't live like that and hope to grow old." They drove down out of the foothills into the valley. Eventually, China said, "I can still see her standing in the steamy darkness on the banks of that canal, greasy with sweat, her hair hanging damp and all tangled, covered with mosquito bites, eyes bleary from vodka. Laura, even then she was still the most beautiful woman you've ever seen. She was always so beautiful, so perfect on the outside, like someone out of a dream, like an angel. But she was never half as beautiful as when she was excited, when there'd been violence. I can see her standing there, only visible because of the greenish glow from the headlights of the Mercedes rising through the murky canal water. So ravishing in that green light, glorious, the most beautiful person you've ever seen, like a goddess from another world." Gradually, China's trembling subsided. The heat of shame faded from her face, but slowly. She was immeasurably grateful for Laura's concern and support. A friend, until Laura, China had lived secretly with her past, unable to speak of it to anyone. Now, having unburdened herself of another hateful, corrupting memory, she couldn't begin to put her gratitude into words. "It's okay," Laura said, as if reading China's mind. They rode in silence. They were late for dinner. To China, the Templeton house looked inviting at first glimpse. Victorian, gabled, roomy, with deep porches front and rear. It stood a half-mile off the county road, at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by 120 acres of vineyards. For 3 generations, the Templetons had grown grapes, but they had never made wine. They were under contract to one of the finest vintners in the valley, and because they owned fertile land with the highest quality vines, they received an excellent price for their crop. Sarah Templeton appeared on the front porch when she heard the Mustang in the driveway, and she came quickly down the steps to the stone walkway to greet Laura and China. She was a lovely, girlishly slim woman in her early or mid-40s, with stylishly short blonde hair wearing tan jeans and a lawn-sleeved emerald green blouse with green embroidery on the collar, simultaneously chic and motherly. When Sarah hugged Laura and kissed her and held her with such evident and fierce love, China was struck by a pain of envy and by a shiver of misery at never having known a mother's love. She was surprised again when Sarah turned to her, embraced her, kissed her on the cheek, and, still holding her close, said, "Laura tells me you're the sister she never had, so I want you to feel at home here, sweetheart. When you're here with us, this is your place as much as ours." China stood stiffly at first, so unfamiliar with the rituals of family affection that she didn't know quite how to respond. Then she returned the embrace awkwardly and murmured an inadequate thank you. Her throat was suddenly so tight that she was amazed to be able to speak at all. Putting her arms around both Laura and China, guiding them to the broad flight of porch steps, Sarah said, "We'll get your luggage later. Dinner's ready now. Come along. Laura's told me so much about you, China." "Well, Mom," said Laura, "I didn't tell you about China being into voodoo. I sort of hid that part. She'll need to sacrifice a live chicken every night at midnight while she's staying with us." "We only grow grapes. We don't have any chickens, dear," Sarah said. "But after dinner we can drive to one of the farms in the area and buy a few." China laughed and looked at Laura as if to say, "Where's the infamous look?" Laura understood. "In your honor, China, all wire coat hangers and equivalent devices have been put away." "Whatever are you talking about?" Sarah asked. "You know me, Mom, a babbling ditz. Sometimes not even know what I'm talking about." Paul Templeton, Laura's father, was in the big kitchen, taking a potato and cheese casserole out of the oven. He was a neat, compact man, 5'10", with thick dark hair and a ruddy complexion. He set the steaming dish aside, stripped off a pair of oven mitts, and greeted Laura as warmly as Sarah had done. After being introduced to China, he took one of her hands in both of his, which were rough and work-worn, and with feigned solemnity he said, "We prayed you'd make the trip in one piece. Does my little girl still handle that Mustang as if she thinks it's the Batmobile?" "Hey, Dad," Laura said, "I guess you've forgotten who taught me to drive." "I was instructing you in the basic techniques," Paul said. "I didn't expect you to acquire my style." Sarah said, "I refuse to think about Laura's driving. I'd just be worried sick all the time." "Face it, Mom, there's an Indianapolis 500 gene on Dad's side of the family, and he passed it to me." "She's an excellent driver," China said. "I always feel safe with Laura." Laura grinned to her and gave a thumbs-up sign. Dinner was a long, leisurely affair because the Templetons liked to talk to one another, thrived on talking to one another. They were careful to include China and seemed generally interested in what she had to say. But even when the conversation wandered to family matters of which China had little knowledge, she somehow felt a part of it, as though she was, by a magical osmosis, actually being absorbed into the Templeton clan. Laura's 30-ish brother Jack and his wife Nina lived in the caretaker's bungalow elsewhere in the vineyard, but a previous obligation had prevented them from joining the family for dinner. China was assured that she would see them in the morning, and she felt no trepidation about meeting them, as she felt before she'd met Sarah and Paul. Throughout her troubled life, there had been no place where she had truly felt at home. While she might never feel entirely home in this place either, at least she felt welcome here. After dinner, China and Laura went for a walk in the moonlit vineyards between the rows of low-pruned vines that had not yet begun to sprout either leafy trailers or fruit. The cool air was redolent with the pleasant, fecund smell of freshly plowed earth, and there was a sense of mystery in the dark fields that she found intriguing, enchanting, but at times disconcerting, as if they were among unseen presences, ancient spirits that were not all benign. When they had strolled deep into the vines and then turned back toward the house, China said, "You're the best friend I've ever had." "Me too," Laura said. More than that, China's voice trailed away. She had been about to say, "You're the only friend I've ever had," but that made her seem so lame, and, besides, was still an inadequate expression of what she felt for this girl. They were, indeed, in one sense, sisters. Laura linked arms with her and merrily said, "I know. When you have babies, I want them to call me Aunt China. Listen, Shepherd, don't you think I should find a guy and get married before I start pumping out the babies? Whoever he is, he better be the best husband in the world to you, or I'll promise I'll cut his cajones off." "Do me a favor, okay?" Laura said. "Don't tell him about this promise until after the wedding. Some guys might be put off by it." From elsewhere in the vineyards came a disquieting sound that stopped China, a protracted creaking. "It's just the breeze working at a loose barn door, rusty hinges," Laura said. It sounded as someone were opening a giant door in the wall of night itself and stepping in from another world. China Shepherd could not sleep comfortably in strange houses. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, her mother had dragged her from one end of the country to the other, staying nowhere longer than a month or two. So many terrible things had happened to them in so many places that China eventually learned to view each new house not as a new beginning, not with hope for stability and happiness, but with suspicion and quiet dread. Now she was long rid of her troubled mother and free to stay only where she wished. These days her life was almost as stable as that of a cloistered nun, as meticulously planned as any bomb squad's procedures for disarming an explosive device, and without any of the turmoil on which her mother had thrived. Nevertheless, this first night in the Templetons' house, China was reluctant to undress and go to bed. She sat in the darkness in a medallion-back armchair at one of the two windows in the guest room, gazing out at the moonlit vineyard, fields and hills of the Napa Valley. Laura was in another room, at the far end of the second-floor hall, no doubt sound asleep, at peace because this house was not at all strange to her. From the guest room window, the early spring vineyards were barely visible, vague geometric patterns. Beyond the cultivated rows were gentle hills mantled in long dry grass, silver in the moonlight. An inconstant breeze stirred through the valley, and sometimes the wild grass seemed to roll like ocean waves across the slopes, softly aglimmer with lambent lunar light. Above the hills was the coast range, and above those peaks were cascades of stars and a full white moon. Storm clouds coming across the mountains from the southwest would soon darken the night, turning the silver hills first to pewter and then to blackest iron. When she heard the first scream, China was gazing at the stars, drawn by their cold light, and she had been since childhood fascinated by the thought of distant worlds that might be barren and clean, free of pestilence. At first the muffled cry seemed to be only a memory, a fragment of a shrill argument from another strange house in the past, echoing across time. Often, as a child, eager to hide from her mother and her mother's friends when they were drunk or high, she climbed onto porch roofs or into backyards, slipped through windows onto fire escapes, away to secret places far from the fray, where she could study the stars, and where voices raised in argument or sexual excitement or shrill drug-induced giddiness came to her as though from out of a radio, from faraway places, and people who had no connection whatsoever with her life. The second cry, though also brief and only slightly louder than the first, was indisputably of the moment, not a memory, and China sat forward on her chair, tense, head cocked, listening. She wanted to believe that the voice had come from outside, so she continued to stare into the night, surveying the vineyards and the hills beyond. Breeze-driven waves swelled through the dry grass on the moon-washed slopes, a water mirage like the ghost tides of an ancient sea. From elsewhere in the large house came a soft thump, as though a heavy object had fallen to a carpeted floor. China immediately rose from the chair and stood utterly still, expectant. Trouble often followed voices raised in one kind of passion or another. Sometimes, however, the worst offenses were preceded by calculated silences and stealth. She had difficulty reconciling the idea of domestic violence with Paul and Sarah Templeton, who had seemed kind and loving toward each other as toward their daughter. Nevertheless, appearances and realities were seldom the same, and the human talent for deception was far greater than that of the chameleon, the mockingbird, or the praying mantis, which masked its ferocious cannibalism with a serene and devout posture. Following the stifled cries of the soft thump, silence sifted down like a snowfall. The hush was eerily deep, as unnatural as that in which the deaf lived. This was the stillness before the pounce, the quietude of the coiled snake. In another part of the house, someone was standing as motionless as she herself was standing, as alert as she was, intently listening. Someone dangerous. She could sense the predatory presence, a subtle new pressure in the air, not dissimilar to that preceding a violent thunderstorm. On one level, 6 years of psychology classes caused her to question her immediate fearful interpretation of those night sounds, which conceivably could be insignificant after all. Any well-trained psychoanalyst would have a wealth of labels to pin on someone who leaped first to a negative conclusion, who lived in expectation of sudden violence. But she had to trust her instinct. It had been honed by many years of hard experience. Intuitively certain that safety lay in movement, she stepped quietly away from the chair at the window, toward the hall door. In spite of the moonglow, her eyes had adjusted to darkness during the 2 hours that she had sat in the lightless room, and now she eased through the gloom with no fear of blundering into furniture. She was only halfway to the door when she heard approaching footsteps in the second-floor hallway. The heavy, urgent tread was alien to this house. Unhampered by the interminable second-guessing that accompanied an education in psychology, reverting to the intuition and defenses of childhood, China quickly retreated to the bed. She dropped to her knees. Farther along the hall, the footsteps stopped. A door opened. She was aware of the absurdity of attributing rage to the mere opening of a door, the rattle of the knob being turned, the rasp of the unsecured latch, the spike-sharp squeak of an unoiled hinge. They were only sounds, neither meek nor furious, guilty nor innocent, and could have been made as easily by a priest as by a burglar. Yet she knew that rage was at work in the night. Flat on her stomach, she wriggled under the bed, feet toward the headboard. It was a graceful piece of furniture with sturdy gaub legs, and fortunately it didn't sit as close to the floor as did most beds. 1 inch less of clearance would have prevented her from hiding under it. Footsteps sounded in the hall again. Another door opened. The guest room door, directly opposite the foot of the bed. Someone switched on the lights. China lay with her head turned to one side, her right ear pressed to the carpet. Steering out from under the footboard, she could see a man's black boots and the legs of his blue jeans below mid-calf. He stood just inside the threshold, evidently surveying the room. He would see a bed still neatly made at 1 o'clock in the morning, with 4 decorative needlepoint pillows arranged against the headboard. She had left nothing on the light stands, no clothes tossed on chairs. The paperback novel that she had brought with her for bedtime reading was in a bureau drawer. She preferred spaces that were clean and uncluttered to the point of monastic sterility. Her preference might now save her life. Again, a faint doubt. The acquired propensity for self-analysis that plagued all psychology students flickered through her. If the man in the doorway was someone with a right to be in the house, Paul Templeton or Laura's brother, Jack, who lived with his wife in the vineyard manager's bungalow elsewhere on the property, and if some crisis was unfolding that explained why he would burst into her room without knocking, she was going to appear to be a prime fool, if not a hysteric, when she crawled out from under the bed. Then directly in front of the black boots, a fat red droplet, another, and a third, fell to the wheat gold carpet. Plop, 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 blood. The first 2 soaked into the thick nylon pile. The third held its surface touching, shimmering like a ruby. China knew the blood wasn't that of the intruder. She tried not to think about the sharp instrument from which it might have fallen. He moved off to her right, deeper into the room, and she rolled her eyes to follow him. The bed had carved side rails into which the spread was tightly tucked. No overhanging fabric obstructed her view of his boots. Obversely, without a spread draped to the floor, the space under the bed was more visible to him. From certain angles, he might even be able to look down and see a swatch of her blue jeans, the toe of one of her rock ports, the cranberry red sleeve of her cotton sweater where it stretched over her bent elbow. She was thankful that the bed was queen size, offering more for cover than a single or double. If he was breathing hard, either with excitement or with the rage that she had sensed in his approach, China couldn't hear him. With one ear pressed tightly to the plush carpet, she was half deaf. Wood slats and box springs weighed on her back, and her chest barely had room to expand to accommodate her own shallow, cautious, open-mouth inhalations. The hammering of her compressed heart against her breastbone echoed tympanically within her, and it seemed to fill the claustrophobic confines of her hiding place to such an extent that the intruder was certain to hear. He went to the bathroom, pushed open the door, and flicked on the lights. She had put away all her toiletries in the medicine cabinet, even her toothbrush. Nothing lay out that might alert him to her presence. But was the sink dry? On retiring to her room at 11 o'clock, she had used the toilet and then had washed her hands. That was 2 hours ago. Any residual water in the bowl surely would have drained away or evaporated. Lemon-scented liquid soap in a pump dispenser was provided at the sink. Fortunately, there was no damp bar of soap to betray her. She worried about the hand towel. She doubted that it could still be damp 2 hours after the little use she had made of it. Nonetheless, in spite of her propensity for neatness and order, she might have left it hanging ever so slightly askew, or with one telltale wrinkle. He seemed to stand on the bathroom threshold for an eternity. Then he switched off the fluorescent light and returned to the bedroom. Occasionally, as a little girl, and then not so little, China had taken refuge under beds. Sometimes they looked for her there. Sometimes, though it was the most obvious of all hidey-holes, they never thought to look. Of those who found her, a few had checked under the bed first, but most had left it for last. Another red droplet fell to the carpet as though the beast might be shedding slow tears of blood. He moved toward the closet door. China had to turn her head slightly, straining her neck to keep track of him. The closet was deep, a walk-in with a chain pull light in the center. She heard the distinctive snap of the tugged switch, then the clinking of the metal beads in the chain as they rattled against the light bulb. The Templetons stored their own luggage at the back of that closet, stacked with the other suitcases. China's single bag and train case were not obviously those of a guest in residence. She had brought several changes of clothes, 2 dresses, 2 skirts, another pair of jeans, a pair of chinos, a leather jacket. Because China was the same size as Laura, the intruder might conclude that the few garments on the rod were just spillovers from the packed closet in Laura's room rather than evidence of a house guest. If he had been in Laura's bedroom, however, and had seen the condition of her closet, then what had happened to Laura? She must not think about that. Not now. Not yet. For the moment, she needed to focus all her thoughts, all her wits, on staying alive. 18 years ago, on the night of her 8th birthday in a seaside cottage on Key West, China had squirmed under her bed to hide from Jim Woltz, her mother's friend. A storm had been raging from the Gulf of Mexico, and the sky-blistering lightning had made her fearful of escaping to the sanctuary of the beach, where she'd retreated on other nights. After committing herself to the cramped space under that iron bed, which had been lower slung than this one, she had discovered that she was sharing it with a palmetto beetle. Palmettos were not as exotic or as pretty as their name. In fact, they were nothing more than enormous tropical cockroaches. This one had been as large as a little girl's hand. Ordinarily, the hateful bug would have scurried away from her, but it had seemed less alarmed by her than by the thundering wolves, who had crashed around her small room in a drunken fury, rebounding tirelessly from the furniture and the walls, like an enraged animal throwing itself against the bars of its cage. China had been barefoot, dressed in blue shorts and a white tube-top, and the palmetto beetle had raced in a frenzy over all that exposed skin, between her toes, up and down her legs, and up again, across her back, along her neck, into her hair, over her shoulder, the length of her slender arm. She hadn't dared to squeal in revulsion, afraid of drawing Wolf's attention. He had been wild that night, like a monster from a dream, and she had been convinced that, like all monsters, he possessed supernaturally keen sight and hearing, the better to hunt children. She hadn't even found the courage to strike out at the beetle or knock it away, for fear that Woltz would hear the smallest sound even over the shriek of the storm and the incessant crashing of thunder. She had endured the palmetto's attentions in order to avoid those of Woltz, clenching her teeth to bite off a scream, praying desperately for God to save her, then praying harder for God to take her, praying for an end to the torment, even if by a bolt of lightning, an end to the torment, an end, dear God, an end. Now, although she wasn't sharing the space under this bulb-legged bed with a cockroach, China could feel one crawling over her toes as if she were that barefoot girl again, scurrying up her legs as if she were wearing not jeans but cotton shorts. She had never again worn her hair long since the night of her 8th birthday, when the bug had burrowed through her tresses, but now she felt the ghost of that palmetto in her closely cropped hair. The man in the closet, perhaps capable of atrocities infinitely worse than the wickedest dreams of Woltz, tugged on the chain pull. The light went out with a click, followed by a tinkle of metal beads. The booted feet reappeared and approached the bed. A fresh tear of blood glistened on the curve of black leather. He was going to drop to one knee beside the bed. Dear God, he'll find me cowering like a child, choking on my own stifled scream in a cold sweat, all dignity lost in the desperate struggle to stay alive, untouched and alive, untouched and alive. She had the crazy feeling that when he peered under the side rail, face to face with her, he would be not a man, but an enormous palmetto with multifaceted black eyes. She had been reduced to the helplessness of childhood, to the primal fear that she had hoped never to know again. He had stolen from her the self-respect that she had earned from years of endurance, that she had earned, God damn him, and the injustice of it filled her eyes with bitter tears. But then his blurred boots turned away from her and kept moving. He walked past the bed to the open door. Whatever he thought about the clothes hanging in the closet, apparently he had not inferred from them that the guest room was occupied. She blinked furiously, clearing her tear-blurred vision. He stopped and turned, evidently studying the bedroom one last time, lest he hear her child's shallow exultations. China held her breath. She was glad that she wore no perfume. She was certain that he would have smelled her. He switched off the light, stepped into the hall, and pulled the short door shut as he went. His footsteps moved off the way, and he had come, for her room was the last on the second floor. His tread swiftly faded, cloaked by the fierce pounding of her heart. Her first inclination was to remain in that narrow haven between the carpet and the box springs. Wait until daybreak or even longer. Wait until there came a silence that ceased to seem like the stillness of a crouched predator. But she didn't know what had happened to Laura, Paul, or Sarah. Any of them. All of them. Might be alive, grievously wounded but drawing breath. The intruder might even be keeping them alive to torture them at his leisure. Any newspaper regularly reported stories of cruelty no worse than the possible scenarios that now unreeled vividly in her mind. And if any of the Templetons still lived, China might be their only hope of survival. She had crawled out of all the many hideaways of her childhood with less fear than she felt when she hesitantly slid out from under this bed. Of course she had more to lose now than before she had walked out on her mother 10 years ago. A decent life built on a decade of ceaseless struggle and hard-won self-respect. It seemed madness to take this risk when safety was assured simply by her staying put. But personal safety at the expense of others was cowardice, and cowardice was a right only of small children who lacked the strength and experience to defend themselves. She couldn't simply retreat into the defensive detachment of her childhood. Doing so would mean the end of all self-respect. Slow-motion suicide. It's not possible to retreat into a bottomless pit. One can only plunge. In the open once more, she rose into a crouch beside the bed. For a while, that was as far as she got. She was frozen by the expectation that the door would crash open and that the intruder would burst in again. The house was as echo-free as any airless moon. China rose to her feet and silently crossed the dark guest room. Unable to see the trio of blood drops, she tried to step around the place where they had fallen earlier. She pressed her left ear to the crack between the door and the jamb, listening for movement or breathing in the hall. She heard nothing, yet she remained suspicious. He could be on the other side of the door, smiling, deeply amused to think that she was listening, biding his time, patient because he knew that eventually she would open the door and step into his arms. Screw it. She put her hand on the knob, turned it cautiously, and winced as the spring latch scraped softly out of its notch. At least the hinges were lubricated and silent. Even in the inkiness to which her vision had not totally readapted, she could see that no one was waiting for her. She stepped out of her room and soundlessly pulled the door shut. The guest quarters were off the shorter arm of the L-shaped upstairs hall. To her right were the back stairs, which led down to the kitchen. To her left lay the turn into the longer arm of the L. She ruled out the back stairs. She had descended them earlier in the evening when she and Laura went out to walk the vineyards. They were wooden and worn. They creaked and popped. The stairwell acted as an amplifier, as hollow and efficient as a steel drum. With the house so preternaturally silent, it would be impossible to creep down the back stairs undetected. The second floor hall and the front stairs, on the other hand, were plushly carpeted. From around the corner, somewhere along the main hallway, came a soft amber glow. In the wallpaper, the delicate pattern of faded roses appeared to absorb the light rather than reflect it, acquiring an enigmatic depth that it had not previously possessed. If the intruder had been standing anywhere between the junction of the hallways and the source of the light, he would have cast a distorted shadow across that luminous paper garden or on the wheat gold carpet. There was no shadow. Keeping her back close to the wall, China edged to the corner, hesitated, and leaned out to scout the way ahead. The main hallway was deserted. Two sources of faint amber light relieved the gloom. The first came from a half-open door on the right, Paul and Sarah's suite. The second was much farther down the hallway, past the front stairs on the left, Laura's room. The other doors all seemed to be closed. She didn't know what lay beyond them. Perhaps other bedrooms, a bath, an upstairs study, closets. Although China was most drawn to and most afraid of the lighted rooms, every closed door was also a danger. The unplumbable silence tempted her to believe that the intruder had gone. This was a temptation best resisted. Forward, then, through the paper arbor of printed roses to the half-open door of the master suite, hesitating there, on the brink. When she found whatever waited to be found, all her illusions of order and stability might dissolve. The truth of life might then reassert itself. After 10 years during which she had diligently denied it, chaos, like the flow of a stream of mercury, its course unpredictable. The man in the blue jeans and black boots might have returned to the master suite after leaving the guest room, but more likely not. Other amusements in the house would no doubt be more appealing to him. Fearful of lingering too long in the hall, she sidled across the threshold without pushing the door open wider. Paul and Sarah's room was spacious. A sitting area included a pair of armchairs and footstools facing a fireplace. Bookshelves crammed with hardcovers flanked the mantel, their titles lost in shadows. The nightstand lamps were colorfully patterned ginger jars with pleated shades. One of them was aglow. Crimson streaks and blots stained its shade. China stepped well short of the foot of the bed, already close enough to see too much. Neither Paul nor Sarah was there, but the sheets and blankets were in tangled disarray, trailing onto the floor on the right side of the bed. On the left, the linens were soaked with blood, and a wet spray glistened on the headboard and in an arc across the wall. She closed her eyes, heard something, spun around, crouching in expectation of an assault. She was alone. The noise had always been there, a background hiss, patter, splash of falling water. She hadn't heard it on entering the room, because she had been deafened by bloodstains as loud as the angry shouting of a maddened mob. Synesthesia. The word had stuck with her from a psychology text, more because she thought it was a beautiful arrangement of syllables than because she expected ever to experience it herself. Synesthesia, a confusion of the senses in which a scent might register as a flash of color. A sound actually might be perceived as a scent, and the texture of a surface under the hand might seem to be a trilling laugh or a scream. Closing her eyes had blocked out the roar of the bloodstains, whereupon she had heard the falling water. Now she recognized it as the sound of the shower in the adjoining bathroom. That door was ajar half an inch. For the first time since she had entered from the hallway, China noticed the thin band of fluorescent light along the bathroom jamb. When she looked away from that door, reluctant to confront what might wait beyond it, she spotted the telephone on the right-hand nightstand. That was the side of the bed without blood, which made it more approachable for her. She lifted the handset from the cradle. No dial tone. She had not expected to hear one. Nothing was ever that easy. She opened the single drawer on the nightstand, hoping to find a handgun. No luck. Still certain that her only hope of safety lay in movement, that crawling into a hole and hiding should always be the strategy of last resort, China had gone around to the other side of the king-size bed before she quite realized that she had taken a first step. In front of the bathroom door, the carpet was badly stained. Grimacing, she went to the second nightstand and eased open the drawer. In the mortal fall of light, she discovered a pair of reading glasses with yellow reflections in the half-moon lenses, a paperback men's adventure novel, a box of Kleenex, a tube of lip balm, but no weapon. As she closed the drawer, she smelled burned gunpowder underlying the hot copper stench of fresh blood. She was familiar with that odor. Over the years, more than a few of her mother's friends either had used guns to get what they wanted or had been at least fascinated by them. China had heard no shots. The intruder evidently had a weapon with a sound suppressor. Water continued to cascade into the shower beyond the door. That susurrus splash, though soft and soothing under other circumstances, now abraded her nerves as effectively as the whine of a dentist's drill. She was sure that the intruder wasn't in the bathroom. His work here was done. He was busy elsewhere in the house. Right this minute, she was not as frightened of the man himself as she was of discovering exactly what he had done. But the choice before her was the essence of the entire human agony. Not knowing was ultimately worse than knowing. At last she pushed open the door. Squinting, she entered the fluorescent glare. The roomy bath featured yellow and white ceramic tile. On the walls at chair rail height and around the edges of the vanity and lavatory counters ran a decorative tile band of daffodils and green leaves. She had expected more blood. Paul Templeton was propped on the toilet in his blue pajamas. Lengths of wide strapping tape across his lap fixed him to the bowl. More tape encircled both his chest and the toilet tank, holding him upright. Through the semi-transparent bands of tape, 3 separate bullet wounds were visible in his chest. There might have been more than 3. She didn't care to look for them and had no need to know. He appeared to have died instantly, most likely in his sleep, and to have been dead before he was brought into the bathroom. Grief welled in her, black and cold. Survival meant repressing it at all costs, and surviving was the thing that she did best. A collar of strapping tape around Paul's neck became a leash that tethered him to a hand towel rack on the wall behind the toilet. The purpose was to prevent his head from falling forward onto his chest and to direct his dead gaze toward the shower. His eyelids were taped open, and his right eye was a starburst hemorrhage. Shuddering, China looked away from him. Although the intruder had needed to kill Paul in his sleep to establish control of the house quickly, here he had been fantasizing that the husband was being forced to watch the atrocities committed against the wife. This was a classic tableau, a favorite of those sociopaths who took delight in performing for their victims. They actually seemed to believe that for a while the recently dead could still see, still hear, and were thus capable of admiring the bold antics and posing of a tormentor who feared neither man nor God. Textbooks describe the delusion. In one of her aberrant psychology classes at UCSF, A speaker from the FBI's Behavioral Science section had given them more graphic descriptions of such scenes than any textbooks could provide. Firsthand, however, the impact of this brutality was worse than words could convey, almost paralyzing. China's legs felt heavy and stiff. The tingling in her hands was incipient numbness. Sarah Templeton was in the stall shower, which was separate from the tub. Although the glass door was closed and frosted, China was able to see a faint, vaguely pinkish shape huddled on the shower floor. On the face of the soffit above the glass door, the killer had printed 2 words. The black letters appeared to have been made with multiple strokes of an eyebrow pencil. Dirty bitch. China had never wanted anything as much as she wanted to be free of the obligation to look into this shower stall. Surely Sarah could not be alive. Yet if she turned away without being certain that the woman was beyond all help, ineradicable guilt would ensure that her own survival would become a kind of walking death. Besides, she had committed her life to trying to understand this very aspect of human cruelty, and no published case study would ever bring her close into comprehension that might the things that she saw here, in this house, on this night, the bleak landscape of the sociopathic mind had been externalized. Echoing off the tile walls, the sizzle splash of the falling water sounded like the hissing of serpents and the brittle laughter of strange children. The water must be cold. Otherwise, steam would have been seething over the top of the shower enclosure. China held her breath, gripped the anodized aluminum handle, and opened the stall door. Sarah Templeton had been wearing a pale green teddy and matching panties. Her garments were in a satin ball in one corner of the shower. After her husband had been shot, the woman had evidently been hammered unconscious, perhaps with the butt of the gun. Then she had been gagged. Her cheeks bulged with whatever rag had been forced into her mouth. Strips of strap and tape had sealed her lips. But in the relentless icy spray, the edges of the tape had begun to peel away from her skin. With Sarah, the killer had used a knife. She was not alive. China quietly closed the stall door. If there was such a thing as mercy, then Sarah Templeton had never regained any awareness after being knocked unconscious. She remembered the hug that Sarah had given her on the front walk when she had first arrived with Laura. Repressing tears, she wished that she herself were dead instead of the precious woman in the shower stall. Indeed, she was half dead and less alive by the minute, because a piece of her heart died with each of these people. China returned to the bedroom. She moved away from the bed, but didn't go immediately toward the hall door. Instead, she stood in the darkest corner, shaking uncontrollably. Her stomach rolled, an acidic burning rose in her chest, and a bitter taste filled the back of her mouth. She suppressed an urge to vomit. The killer might hear her retching, and then he would come to get her. Although she'd met Laura's parents only the previous afternoon, China had known them also from her friends' numerous anecdotes and colorful stories of family adventures. She should have felt even more grief than she did, but she had only a limited capacity for it right now. Later it would hit her harder. Grief thrived in a quiet heart, and right now hers thundered with terror and revulsion. She was shocked that the killer had done so much damage while she had sat, unknowing, at the guest room window, brooding on the stars and thinking of other nights when she had gazed at them from rooftops, backyard trees, and beaches. From what she'd seen, he had taken at least 10 or 15 minutes with Paul and Sarah before searching the rest of the large house to locate and overpower the remaining occupants. Sometimes a man like this got a special thrill from risking interruption, even apprehension. Perhaps a half-asleep, bewildered child would be drawn into the parents' room by some commotion and then would have to be pursued and dragged down before escaping the house. Such possibilities heightened the pleasure that the creep took from his activities in the bedroom and the bath. This was a pleasure to him, a compulsion, but not one over which he despaired. Fun, his recreation, no guilt, therefore no anguish. Savagery gladdened him. Somewhere in the house he was either at play or resting until he was ready to begin the game again. As her shakes subsided to shivers, China grew increasingly afraid for Laura. Those two muffled cries minutes ago had surely come after Sarah was already dead. So Laura must have been surprised in her sleep by a man smelling of her mother's blood. As soon as he had overpowered and secured her, he had hurried to search the rest of the second floor, concerned that another member of the family might have been alerted by her stifled screams. He might not have returned immediately to Laura. Having found no one in any of the other rooms, confident that the house was firmly under his reign, he most likely had gone exploring. If the textbooks were correct, he would probably wish to violate every private space, pour through contents of his hosts' and hostesses' closets and desk drawers, eat food from their refrigerator, read their mail, perhaps finger and smell the soiled clothing in the laundry room hamper. If he could locate collections of family photographs, he might even sit in the den for an hour or longer, amusing himself with those albums. Sooner or later, however, he would return to Laura. Sarah Templeton had been an extremely attractive woman, but night visitors like this man were drawn toward youth. They fed on innocence. Laura was his meat of choice, as irresistible as birds' eggs to certain tree-climbing serpents. When at last China overcame her racking nausea and was certain that she wouldn't betray herself by being suddenly and violently sick, she crept out of the corner and silently crossed the room. She wouldn't have been safe in the master suite anyway. Before the visitor left, he was likely to return here for one last look at poor Sarah in the shower, with her slender arms crossed in a pathetic and ineffective posture of defense. At the half-open door, China paused to listen. Directly across the hall, the faded roses on the wallpaper seemed more mysterious than ever. The pattern had such enigmatic depth that she was almost convinced she might be able to part the thorny vines and step out of that paper arbor into a sunny realm where, when she looked back, this house would not exist. With the light from the nightstand lamp behind her, she could not ease cautiously into the doorway and take her time peeking left and right, because when she moved onto the threshold, she would cast a shadow on those faded roses across the hall. Dawdling behind that unavoidable announcement of herself would be dangerous. Seduced by a long silence that seemed to promise safety, she finally sidled between the half-open door and the jamb into the hallway, and he was there, 10 feet away, near the head of the front stairs, which lay to the right. His back was to her. She froze, half in the hallway, half on the threshold to the master suite. If he turned, she would not be able to slip away before he glimpsed her from the corner of his eye. Yet she was unable to move now while there was still a chance to avoid him. She was afraid that if she made any sound whatsoever, he would hear it and spin toward her. Even the micro-whispers of carpet fibers compressing under her shoe if she moved seemed certain to draw his attention. The visitor was doing something so bizarre that China was as transfixed by his activity as by her fear. His hands were raised in front of him, stretched as high as he could reach, and his spread fingers languorously combed the air. He seemed to be in a trance, as though trying to sing psychic impressions from the ether. He was a big man, 6'2", maybe even taller, muscular, narrow waist, enormous shoulders. His denim jacket stretched tautly across his broad back. His hair was thick and brown, neatly barbered against the nape of his bull neck. But China could not see his face. She hoped never to see it. His seinen fingers, stained with blood, looked crushingly strong. He would be able to choke the life out of her with a single hand grip. "Come to me," he murmured. Even in a whisper, his rough voice had a timbre and a power that were magnetic. "Come to me." He seemed to be speaking not to a vision that only could see, but to China, as if his senses were so acute that he had been able to detect her merely from the movement of the air that she had displaced when she'd stepped soundlessly through the doorway. Then she saw the spider. It dangled from the ceiling on a gossamer filament a foot above the killer's reaching hands. "Please." As if responding to the man's supplications, the spider spun out its thread, descending. The killer stopped reaching, turned his hand palm up. "Little one," he breathed. Fat and black, the obedient spider reeled itself down into the big open palm. The killer brought his hand to his mouth and tipped his head back slightly. He either crushed the spider and ate it, or ate it alive. He stood motionless, savoring. Finally, without looking back, he went to the head of the stairs on the right, at the midpoint of the hallway, and descended spider-quick and almost spider-silent to the first floor. China shuddered, stunned to be alive. And that was chapter 1. Yes, a long chapter. So, what did you think of Intensity so far? I read this years ago. I do not have a review on Goodreads. I may have one on my blog. Let me go check out my blog, because I was not in Goodreads then, but I did a blog for many, many, many years, and I might have, let me see if I have like Dean Koontz, horror. I don't have Dean Koontz on there. Let me see if I have horror, fantasy, horror. Let me see. Nope, I don't have it. So all I remember is that this had me sitting on the edge of my seat. I think I read it in 2 days. I could not put it down, and I gave it 5 stars. Other than that, I don't remember a lot to tell you. It came out in 1996. The hardcover was 208 pages. I think it says 200. No, maybe it's 308. It's 308 pages. And yeah, I could not put it down. I don't remember the ending at this moment. If I probably could go back and read the end. But yeah, if you like intense, you like horror, I highly recommend Intensity by Dean Koontz. He's one of my favorite authors. And I hope that you enjoyed this. I will have the link below for this book. If this magazine is still available somewheres, I will have the link for that down below. But thank you so much for watching. If you made it up to this point, thank you so much. Love you guys. You all have a great day. Bye-bye.